I would like to thank the NALANDA-SRIWIJAYA Centre for having me here today. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my paper today is about the Dutch and Portuguese sources or records on the history of Singapore before 1800. And here's my synopsis of what I'm going to be talking about today. I will give you some preliminary comments about what I will be saying in my paper, the central part of it. I will then be asking a series of questions about the nature, the scope, and the problems arising from the study of these texts in relation to the early history of Singapore. I will then proceed to say or identify some patterns that we can discern from looking at the big picture, and I will then give you some of my tentative conclusions on this matter. Let me now proceed to give you the preliminaries of the paper. This is not a reconstruction that I'm making today about Singapore history as such. I'm just going to give you some general comments about the sources that I've been looking at, about their nature, and I don't want to overwhelm you with too much detail, which could be the great danger of holding a paper of this particular nature. And what I want to do is really step back and share my experiences with you that I've collected over the last 2 decades working with these materials as I progressively identify more and problematize them and try to put them into context. I'll give you a closer look at the different types of sources that we have out there. They're not just texts of a classic nature, they're different kinds of materials we can look at, and I will say something about what they tell us and what they don't tell us. They have very many shortcomings indeed. And for today I will be focusing on the Portuguese sources and some of the Dutch materials, just broadly defined. This is something we will have to discuss in a moment, and we will be looking at Portuguese and Dutch cartography from the 16th and 17th centuries in particular. I am fully aware, and the question came also before my paper started, about earlier attempts at processing these materials. And there are 2 names that come to mind immediately. The first is Carl Alexander Gibson Hill, the last expatriate director of the Raffles Museum, who so cogently put together a history of the Singapore Straits based on materials that he had at his fingertips. Working on this in the 1950s is far more challenging, or was more challenging than it would be today. We didn't have internet access, and it involved a lot of tedious correspondence with archives, as we know, who don't necessarily respond very quickly. The other person that needs to be mentioned here is a young man by the name of Ian Alistair McGregor, who was a lecturer in the history department at what was then the University of Singapore. McGregor is known for his articles published in the Journal of the Malayan Branch of the Royal Asiatic Society on the Portuguese in Malaya and certain other events that took place, for example, in the Johor River estuary, another battle yet, and also for his study of the campaign against Johor Lama in the late 1580s. McGregor set up really the first primordial library holdings of the university that deal with Portuguese sources. They are still there, and when I started working on this topic about 2 decades ago, I received many inquiries from members of the public and also from fellow academics from around the world asking, well, what did Ian McGregor know? He unfortunately passed away at a very young age. We agreed that he was probably in his late 20s when he died, mysteriously. And there was always this assumption that McGregor had taken many secrets with him to the grave about the history of early Singapore. I'm not quite sure what these secrets might be. I have trawled most of the sources that he has been using and probably a couple of more on top of that. Let me now proceed to just formulate a few questions about what it is that we should be thinking about today. What kind of sources do we have at our fingertips that we can look at to study and reconstruct the history of Singapore before 1800? The second one is, well, we're looking today at Portuguese and Dutch sources. So what is a Portuguese source? What is a Dutch source? It seems to be a very basic question, but it is not necessarily easily answered, as we will see in a moment. Who wrote this text, for example, or who drew a particular map? What purpose was it to serve, and what end did they seek to achieve with it? What are the sources interested in, especially the texts? How many do we have out there, and how substantial are these testimonies? There's a great range between them in terms of word count, for example. What are the main challenges that we have in studying the early cartography of Singapore? And when does the toponym Singapore, or one of its very many garbled variants, what do they mean? And specifically, what do they refer to? That is also not very clear, always. What are the other names that Singapore had? The island, the settlement, and more specifically, how were they understood by the Portuguese at the time? The idea of the Lion City, I may point out immediately at this stage, is only one particular understanding of the name Singapore, or Singapura, historically speaking. Let's turn first to the question, what types of sources are out there? They fall basically into four major categories. We have material objects, mostly, as we know, from the 15th century, but very little from later periods. I understand that archaeology will be a separate paper in this series, so for the benefit of my colleagues who will come after me, I will leave the subject of archaeology alone for the time being. We also have texts, several of them, and of a very diverse nature. We have navigational instructions, so-called rutters. These are physical navigational instructions that also sometimes contain market information about ports and destinations and what to trade in proceeding from one location to another. We have travel reports, we have letters, we have formal treaties, we have chronicles, we even have encyclopedia entries from the 18th century. I will be talking about those in a moment, and we have these all in printed and in manuscript form. In addition to these texts, we also have charts and maps used for a variety of reasons. Some of them are published, some of them remained in manuscript form, some of them were controlled in the number of copies that were made, especially on the Portuguese and the Dutch side, because they contain sensitive market information, and one didn't want one's competitors to get hold of this. And finally, there's also scientific information. Historians are becoming more aware that we can reconstruct the history of Singapore by also looking at some of the things our colleagues in the science departments are working on, evidence of changes in wind patterns, precipitations, the presence of droughts and floods, earthquakes, volcano eruptions, tsunami, or even the spread of diseases. These are all very interesting factors that can be taken into account in helping us put the history of Singapore together before 1800. Now, I admit that not all of these are of equal significance, especially with reference to Singapore. Well, there are not very many volcano eruptions here, for example. But there can be earthquakes and volcano eruptions that affected Singapore's larger trading network, and if networks collapse because of massive destruction by a volcano or a tsunami, that can in turn also impact the way trade flowed through Singapore. So my focus today, however, will be on points number 2 and 3, the texts and the manuscripts and charts. I'm now going to turn to that interesting question of, well, what is a Portuguese source, or what is even a Dutch source? Is this defined by language? Is it defined by the author's particular affiliation? Or is it about the location they are working from? In other words, they are sitting in somewhere like Goa or Malacca in the time of Portuguese rule. What determines what a Portuguese source is? Well, the first definition is, of course, language. If the document is written in Portuguese or alternatively in Dutch, then that would make it qualify as a Portuguese source. But I have to immediately point out that not all sources are written in Dutch and Portuguese. In the case, for example, of Malacca, we have a testimony in Italian by John of Empoli, who wrote letters back home to his family, and these are in Italian. And Empoli was in the entourage of Alphonse d'Albuquerque when he took Malacca. So, is that now a Portuguese source, or is it an Italian source? How do you want to classify this? The same problem also emerges with the Dutch sources. One of the best testimonies I've worked with for the history of Johor and also for the geography of Singapore at the time is written in German by an officer who was from Meissen in Saxony, and he was in the employ of the Dutch East India Company. He came with one of the Dutch East India Company fleets, but his text is written in German. So, is that a German source, or is it a Dutch source? He's officially an employee of the Dutch company, so how do you want to classify this? What about missionary reports? There are several of these that are very interesting. Do we go by the language they're written in? Most of them are written in Latin. That was sort of the lingua franca among especially the learned missionaries. Or do we not attribute a nationality to them at all? This is not necessarily a very simple exercise. So what is a Portuguese and a Dutch source is a bit more complicated than it would look on the surface. This is neither a Portuguese nor a Dutch source. This is a reconstruction of a map of the region based on an Ottoman rutter preserved in manuscript form in the National Library in Vienna. When you read the text, you will realize that the Ottomans did obtain information from the Portuguese because they mentioned them specifically in this text. What is interesting about this particular reconstructed map is that there is a port of Singapore in 1558 being mentioned. And the location of this particular port is also given in, well, their own scientific form of the time in ISBA. In other words, in how many thumbs above the constellation of the sun that you would have at a given time of the year. And you will recognize a number of names here. These are from this Saidiali's Muhit from 1558, preserved in Vienna. The question now is, who drew it, who wrote it, and for what purpose? It's really a case of know your author here. We know, for example, that Tomé Pires, a famous book that we like to use and frequently cite in the context of early Malay, Malacca, and Singapore history. We know that he was a pharmacist, an apothecary, and that he was working in the employ of the Portuguese authorities in Malacca. He collected many oral testimonies. For example, the story about Parameswara is found in Tomé Pires as well. But to what what end is he recording all of this? What did he want to achieve with it? This is a far more difficult question to answer. There is this feeling among some of the scholars that he may have exaggerated his accounts slightly, especially over-exaggerated the significance of Malacca. There is a debate in academic circles about this. So we need to problematize the nature of these texts, and I point here especially to Rui Loureiro's new edition of Tome Pires, which, if I'm not mistaken, came out earlier this year or late last year. Another Portuguese author, Heredia, his works have come under closer scrutiny in recent years. For example, Jorge Flores, who now works at the European University Institute, to the best of my knowledge. Also Rui Loureiro and John Everhart, a retired professor at Ghent University in Belgium, have all worked in the last 15 to 20 years on works related or stemming from the hand of Heredia. Jorge Flores has basically condemned Heredia as something of a fraud. The Rui Loureiro has published several pieces on it, including now, as you see here on the right, and that didn't quite turn on, his much known and spoken about, but very little read treatise on Mount Ophir, which he wrote in 1616. I've seen several references to it over the years, but I've never actually seen the text until this particular book came into my hand. And John Everhart produced about 15 years ago another manuscript found in the University of Ghent's library titled Sumo de Árboles. This is when Heredia was working on plants and trees. It's a very lovely illustrated book. And again, the introduction, which is written in French, is fairly critical of Heredia's achievements as an author and historian of the region. When we look at all of these sources, the Singapore references can be meaningless, they really don't yield anything at all, or they can be totally confused. We will see in a moment that it is not always clear what the name Singapore means. And that is not only something that is problematic of Singapore. I recently had a heated discussion with somebody about the name Malacca. Malacca is not just the city of Malacca, it can also be the surrounding territory. It can refer to a polity or an empire, if you so wish. And in cartography of the early modern period, Malacca is also the Malay Peninsula. So when somebody uses the name Malacca, well, what exactly are they referring to? It's not always clear. And I find myself going back many times to a given passage, trying to unlock what it is that the author is trying to tell us. These are very difficult texts. They are not easy to unlock in terms of their meaning. A lot has to do with the fact that vernacular languages were not as highly developed as they are today, and the level of education that the authors had also varied greatly. It's wonderful to read documents in Latin that are crisp and clear, written by some intelligent Jesuit sitting in Manila or in Goa. It's a different thing to look at a document from a low-ranking clerk sitting in Malacca or Goa who can hardly express themselves in a coherent sentence. How substantial are these testimonies? And how many do we have? I haven't counted them manually. I'd say there are about 400 to 500 Portuguese passages that I am aware of. There are probably as many, possibly a couple more in Dutch. So let's say there are about 1,000 testimonies that are known in total, or that I am aware The vast majority of these are very short. They mention Singapore in a couple of words. Anything over 2 or 3 lines or even a paragraph are extremely rare. I would put that at maybe 5% at most. So in other words, we're looking at maybe 150 to 100 testimonies that are beyond a paragraph or a couple of lines. There are not very many more than that. And they don't necessarily yield the information that we want them to. And as I say, a lot of these are meaningless. They're just quick aside references that they make to Singapore. The one, for example, in Mount Ophir, there is one single reference to Singapore, and it's just a reference to the Straits. It really doesn't yield us any specific information that we don't already know. And they don't always tell us what we would like them to. I have mentioned here the letters of Francis Xavier, the Jesuit missionary and saint in the Catholic Church, was at anchor, probably off of Sentosa, waiting for the tides to change, and he scribbled a couple of letters while he was sitting on deck. They're strictly ecclesiastical nature. He's talking about church affairs. He doesn't waste any time whatsoever in describing the scenery that he has while he is anchored off of Sentosa. So they don't really give us anything. Aradia's Mount Ophir, I just mentioned that. There's just a quick reference to the Singapore Straits, and that's it in the entire book. John of Lisbon's Rudder is another one. Navigational instructions for the Straits, and somewhere he just says, yes, and then you come out. And then there is the town of Singapore. Yeah, the Portuguese destroyed it a couple of years ago. Well, that's it. They destroyed it a couple of years ago. Doesn't say where it is, how big it is, how important it was. Doesn't say any of that. It just says, yeah, they destroyed it a few years ago. That's it. So the information is very sparse that we can sometimes glean out of it. Most of the references that we have are to the straits, the waters, the islands around it, occasionally to the Arangalau, where the pushcart vendors of the sea, they would come up in their boats and sell fish and fresh fruit and chicken to the passing vessels while they were waiting for the tides to change. Often the information that we have is very generic and of very little value indeed. When I look at these testimonies as a whole, they fall into 3 broad categories. And excuse me for stereotyping here, but I think it is very helpful to do this in this context. The first one is the enthusiast, the second one is the adolescent, and the third one is the incidental reference. The first one, the enthusiast, is like your 5-year-old son coming back from the night safari, and you ask him, so how was your day in the night safari, or how was your excursion to the night safari? He says, oh, it was fantastic, and then we did this, and then we had ice cream, and then we saw the otters, and then we passed the tiger cage, and then we did this, and then this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, right? Little, pearls of information strung up, connected with Anne, at no depth whatsoever. A lot of the texts are written exactly like that. Yeah? And whatever caught the eye of the observer, like your 5-year-old son who went to the night safari. Now imagine yourself on the basis of that having to try to reconstruct the layout of the night safari 500 years on from here. You're going to probably know that the ice cream stand was somewhere near the tiger cage, but little more than that. You're not going to be able to reconstruct very much. The other one is the adolescent. This is your teenage daughter who has also gone to the night safari and come back. And you say, so how was it? And she says, yeah, it was okay. So did you see anything? Yeah, it was all right. So what did you notice? Oh, some animals. The otters were cute. The otters were cute. That's the only thing you have to go by, right? The otters were cute. That's the information you're going to get out of it. Yeah, there were animals in the zoo. Yeah. So it's the sort of the detached, and they're mainly interested at that age in themselves and what their friends are doing, yeah? And she was probably ogling the boys as well. But little more than that, and there are testimonies like that too. Yeah, there were natives standing on the beach. Well, what is that going to give you? And somehow you realize that when they're focused on talking about themselves and what their friends are doing, this is taking place against the canvas of being somewhere in this region. But they don't give you any information, yeah? You had a mountain in the background and natives were standing on the beach. That's the sort of information you're going to get out of it. And then there's the incidental kind of reference, the one like John of Lisbon. Oh yeah, the Portuguese destroyed that place a few years ago. That's it. Yeah, just sort of an aside mention. So these are the difficulties that we face in looking at these types of sources. And they don't necessarily provide us the detail that we would really like to have. So what are the texts interested in? Well, occasionally I get excited emails from around the world about, oh wow, I've just, looked at this and in the archive I found a reference to Singapore. And I said, did you now? Let's have a look at what it has to say. And it's usually just a reference to the Straits or something, one of the islands that they went and fetched water on off the coast of Singapore. But it really doesn't give very much information. And I've had so many of these false alarms over the years that raised expectations and quite a bit of excitement, but then turned out to be little more than just a casual reference. And frankly, what can you observe from the deck of a passing ship? There was, we know, very thick foliage. In fact, some of the very dramatic accounts of going through the old Strait of Singapore between present-day Sentosa and harbourfront. They're saying that there were these big sprawling trees and that the crowns would either brush against the mast or rip holes into the sail, or the mangroves were scraping against the hull of the vessel. It must have been a very dramatic thing. But the point, I guess, is to bear in mind that there's thick foliage. So if there was a town, how much of it would you have seen from the deck of a passing ship? Most of this township would have been covered by foliage. So that's what we have. We have some accounts of fetching fresh water on land. These are a bit more dramatic. Usually there they say the Orang-Laut came, with their poison darts and were chasing after them, and then they quickly head tail back to their ship and took cover. Direct references to the town of Singapore do exist. They do exist in Portuguese, they exist in Spanish, they have them in Dutch, and they have them in German texts as well. But there are very big problems with these references because all of them that I know about are very inconclusive about the exact location of the settlement, about the size of the settlement, and about the activity that took place in the port. We know that Singapore had a shop bandar, we know it had a functioning port. There are several references to people who met the Shah Bandar or described the port as one of the best that serves the East Indies. But we don't know how big it was, and we don't know how busy it was, and we know very little about the settlement. We don't even know exactly where the settlement is, because the references are so vague, it doesn't help us very much in locating where this might have been. How do the Portuguese sources stack up to the Dutch ones? They're very different in nature because the authors are trying to achieve something very different with them. The Portuguese sources, especially the chronicles, are mainly there to celebrate the heroic exploits of the Portuguese. There is sometimes military and commercial information of a confidential nature that is the focus of these documents, and sometimes they're recording oral histories that they had picked up in talking to the locals. For example, Tomé Pires and his story about Parameswara and how he staged a coup d'etat in Singapore and fled to Muar and founded the city of Malacca. These are recorded oral histories from other sources of a local type. Much really depends on the nature and purpose of the document, the first-hand familiarity with the actual situation on the ground, not just hearsay that they got from others who had been there, and of course the level of education of the author, the scribe, that is copying the document. The Dutch sources, by contrast, are mostly of a commercial nature. We are dealing here with a chartered East India Company whose ostensible purpose is to collect as much information about politics and market conditions as possible, and to describe and grasp the nature of diplomacy and the mechanisms of trade. And the Dutch, when they come here in the 1590s, are really facing a very steep learning curve, and they're amassing as much information as possible because they really need to learn how to get to grips with these people that they're encountering in the markets that they're engaging in. The Portuguese had a 100-year head start on that. We do have, however, an unexpected surge or plethora of information, mainly dating from that period, 1595, that's the arrival of the Dutch in the East Indies, and 1640 is when the Portuguese are evicted from Malacca in a military campaign by the Dutch. And so the Luso-Dutch conflict in the first half of the 17th century actually leaves us with a vast paper trail of information that we can draw on. The period before is restricted mainly to the Portuguese sources, and the period after is restricted mainly to the Dutch sources, but their focus is no longer here in the area around the peninsula. And so the information in terms of sheer volume really diminishes quite substantially after 1640. For reconstructing the history of Johor and Singapore and the region at large, it might be more helpful to draw on the Dutch sources because they do give us more detailed information on the types of commodities that were sold, the volumes, the price structures, and the mechanisms of trade and the sources of where these goods came from. Barring certain noteworthy exceptions, such as Pires, for example, the Portuguese textual sources are a bit less diverse in the type of information that they impart, but it doesn't mean that they're not important. They just yield different types of information. And so this brings us now, after the texts, to the issue of cartography of the region. And the first question is, so what is really tricky about these maps? How much of the information is actually based on actual on-the-ground experience, or are these done by armchair travelers back in Europe? We have several garbled place names that make the identification of what we're looking at very, very tricky indeed. And the location is often totally confused. As you can see here, Singapore can and was sometimes depicted in cartography as a city on the Malay or Johor mainland, not on an island. This was very common in the second half of the 16th century before the Dutch arrive in this part of the world. This here, Portuguese map by Gaspar Viegas from 1537, is probably the first to depict Singapore as a distinct island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, and recognizably so. The information in 1537 was probably based on a series of military campaigns that took place just 2 years earlier in the Johor River region. So the information that they had collected on the surroundings of this part of the peninsula and the island world of Riau was quickly incorporated into the cartography. Slightly later here, we have a Dutch sample from 1620 by Hessel-Gerrits. This is from one of the very early maps of the region done by the Dutch East India Company. Hessel-Gerrits was the chief hydrographer of the company, and on the left you have the larger excerpt of the peninsula and the islands. And on the right, you have the routes past the island. And this is very interesting because here you have the three different routes through the Singapore Straits. The one that would go on the inside of what was the Sembilan Islands, now Jurong Island, along Pasir Panjang, and then through the area there between Sentosa and Harbourfront. The second one branches off there around Labrador Park and goes along the southern side of Sentosa and then around the islands to the south of that, and then in branches again or merges again with the route along the coast of Singapore and then out toward Pedra Branca. And the third one comes much down further south. This is mainly where today's international fairway would be that the container ships take when they pass Singapore at the border roughly between Singapore and Indonesia in the international shipping lane. So these are the three routes marked up here very nicely in this map around 1620. Going a bit forward in time, 1654, we have another sample of a Portuguese map. I am aware of two copies of this map. One is in the Casa de Bragança in Vila Visões, outside of Lisbon. The other one, this particular sample, is in the Maritime Museum in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. It is done by a Portuguese cartographer, and it is one of the most detailed we have of the 17th century. It indicates here several names on the island of Singapore, including, as you see there in the middle, Shabandaria, the office of the Shabandar, and then it also has marked there the entrance to the Old Strait of Singapore. That is the one between Sentosa and Harbourfront, and then it says Estreito Governador, the Governor Strait. That is the main strait that is used by the international shipping today, the main fairway. And then I think after there it says Entrada de Bulau is the entry to the Strait of Bulan, which is in Indonesian area today. We have a real problem looking at or identifying sources on Singapore, because neither the name of the city nor the name of the island is used very consistently. If we just look at the name Singapore, it isn't going to yield us with very much. We have a terrible confusion of nomenclature, and this really makes the evaluation of these materials difficult. It's not always clear what a given name refers to, and there are different names and different locations for the settlement as said. When is the toponym Singapore, or one of its many garbled variants, used, and what does it actually refer to? Singapore has many orthographical variants. It can be written with a C, it can be written with other things, and it can mean any of these. It can be the island, a settlement and a port, a cape, a promontory, a coastal range, and a gateway. It can also refer to, if we read André Tevet in the late 16th century, refer to an entire hinterland, which would be roughly equivalent to the modern state of Johor in Malaysia, south of the Pahang and Muar rivers. So the name Singapore has been used to refer to any of the above. And when they say Singapore is this, what are they actually referring to here? Singapore can also refer to any one of the straits, the Old Strait of Singapore, the New Strait of Singapore, and sometimes the Governor's Strait. That's the third one, the main fairway today. And the sense of confusion is brought today, or to light, in the German encyclopedia of the 18th century by Zedler. Zedler isn't particularly brilliant in any way, but it is simply a summary and a manifestation of what an intelligent person who would do some research might be able to find at that particular point in time. And it is also a reflection of the methodology the Zedler authors were using. There are no less than 5 different entries, some under different spellings, used for Singapore in that particular encyclopedia, which just proves to you that Singapore is not an unknown place in the 18th century. That is basically the takeaway from it. It can mean several things. It is not an unknown place in the middle of the 18th century. It has 5 entries in the German encyclopedia alone. In early cartography, especially of the pre-Portuguese or early Portuguese period, we find a different set of nomenclature. Usually in the maps before 1516, we have a prefix ba, bar, or gar, which are phonetic and probably refer to the Persian name for coastal area or region. The middle section is usually jim, sin, or shin, which is the name given to the littoral of the South China Sea. We will recall that Ottoman reconstructed map that we had, the Bar Chin, the coast of Chin, and the last section is Gapara or Gopara or Gapura, which is the word for gate or gateway. So there seems to be the idea behind it that Singapore acts as something like a gate or a gateway. And the Portuguese do use that sometimes in the early writings. They refer to the Strait of Singapore as the Porta de Singapura, the Porta. The gateway, not to be confused with Porto, which is the port. So one letter difference makes a huge change in its meaning. In the maps before 1550, usually the name Singapore refers to either a gateway or the idea that this is a point of transition taking place between 2 maritime zones, a cape or a promontory, not necessarily to the straits, and not necessarily to a settlement either. Here you have little excerpt samples from cartography that I have found. It's an elastic toponym with different spellings and different meanings. Here we have some samples for you, the gateway or promontory or the coastal region. There you have it there, top line, 3rd insert, the Bar Chin, the coast of Chin. Which is also used for coastal Vietnam and other areas. It is here in the 2nd row, a cape. You see C, Singapula. The L and the R frequently get confused or interchanged, such as notably Blanca and Branca for the color white in Portuguese and Spanish. And it is also sometimes a city on the mainland. Here we have 3 samples of Singapore as a city on the peninsular mainland. What are the other names that Singapore Island or the settlement had, beyond the Lion City, as I call it? Well, Brás de Albuquerque and Baros, the chronicler of the 16th century, say that the name Singapura means Falsa de Mora, which is the wrong or tricky or difficult place to be. And they immediately then proceed to explain why it is called like that. They say, yeah, well, that's a good name because there are these terrible tempests that hit the coast of Singapore every now and then, and it's a very terrible place to be. Your ships at anchor, they will sink and destroy the entire cargo, so this is really not the place to be. So, Falls of the Mora, the wrong place. Singapura as Singapura, the place where you interrupt your voyage. This is something that Wheatley brought up in the 1960s as well. Jacques de Couta calls it the Isla de la Chabandaria Vieja, the island of the old Chabandaria, or Chabandar's compound, with Chabandaria for the name of the settlement. And the island is more frequently than not in the early modern cartographical specimens called Pulau Panjang, or one of its translated variants in Dutch, Het Lange Eiland, or Long Island, or Il Panjang in French, and this remains in current usage until the end of the 18th century. There is one example that I have found recently, Insel Gubernator. This is the name used by the Jesuit Lijnbeckhoven, who became the Catholic Bishop of Nanjing in the 18th century. He passed by Singapore and makes an interesting set of observations with regard to nomenclature and the island. And so we now come roughly to the end of what I wanted to present to you today. Are there more sources to be found? I would never want to exclude that, but they're probably not going to be in the most likely places. They're probably going to be tucked away in some private or monastic libraries and no longer in the big, known, well-documented public collections. And do the early modern sources contain dark and undisclosed secrets, that are just waiting to be discovered? Again, I don't want to exclude the possibility, but let me just tell you this, from what I have been working on. If they do contain any dark secrets, they won't be immediately recognizable. I often have to look at texts for years before I understand what the author is trying to say here. So it is not necessarily immediately visible if it is the case. The sources are what they are, warts and all, and they don't necessarily tell us what we would like them to, and we have to accept that fact. And we have to accept that there are numerically more testimonies from certain periods than from other ones. The period 1511 to 1640 is fairly well documented, but it tapers off quite quickly and picks up again in the third quarter of the 18th century, when the Dutch are engaging Riau in war. The written sources are often difficult to read and even more difficult to understand, and it depends on the nature of the text, the purpose for which a document was prepared, and importantly also the level of education of the given author or copyist or scribe who put it on paper. Most of the information is fragmentary and range from a few words to a couple of lines. As I said, there are about 1,000 testimonies known to me. The vast majority of them are yielding very little indeed. It's the 5% that we need to look at a bit more closely. It's not always clear, moreover, what the name Singapura is taken to refer to. It can mean anything from a city, a port, a settlement, an island, a promontory, a coastal range, a strait, or an entire hinterland. Or all of them, or a combination of them. It's not always clear. We have different understandings to the name Singapura found in the 16th century texts. The cartography yields another one. This Bar Singapura, for example, gives us a very different explanation from the one that we are familiar with from the Malay annals. Most of the references that we have are of a marginal, ephemeral, or relevant nature to the purpose that we are trying testimonies, but they are the exception rather than the norm. I have been looking at all of this material again from a very different angle, and I think looking at materials from different angles really does help us slice through and dissect what authors are trying to tell us. And there are three conclusions that I have come to in recent months about this. The first one is a reference to the Malays, the embrace your enemy philosophy. They're very much, when the Europeans arrive in this part of the world, they see them as challengers, yes, but they also embrace them and use them to their own ends. And embrace your enemy is an interesting philosophy for dealing with outsiders. The Europeans, moreover, and this is an article I have finished and is waiting to be published, is they rely a lot on local help in the early years. This is not just true with reference to the Dutch benefiting from the Malays, but also from the overseas Chinese, whom they engaged on various occasions and asked them to assist them in finding their way around, opening up market opportunities, and particularly in their ill-fated attempt to crack open the Chinese market in the early 17th century. And there's also a certain element of togetherness here, that they do and embark on joint projects together. These have often been forgotten in history, but it is really worthwhile